Nothing matters. Imagine the last conscious being in the universe, standing on a frozen rock orbiting a dying star. Behind it, 14 billion years of cosmic evolution, galaxies forming from primordial hydrogen, stars igniting and exploding, heavy elements forged in stellar cores, planets coalescing from dust, and on one unremarkable world, life arising from chemistry and stumbling toward awareness. All of it has led to this moment. The creature looks up at the last dim ember of light in an otherwise black sky. In a few hours, that ember will fade. The universe will continue, matter and energy persisting according to physical law, but no one will be there to witness it. No one will remember that anything ever existed. Every love, every war, every poem, every act of cruelty and kindness, every birth and death, every moment of joy or agony experienced by any conscious being across billions of years and billions of worlds. All of it will be as if it never happened. The universe will not notice. It never noticed. This is not a mood. It is not depression or teenage angst or a cry for help. It is a possibility that must be reckoned with, that the universe has no purpose, that human life has no cosmic significance, and that the meanings we construct are stories we tell ourselves because the alternative is unbearable. The question of nihilism is whether this possibility is true, and if it is, how we are supposed to live. Consider a more intimate scene. A woman stands at a graveside. Her father has just been buried. She is the last person alive who remembers him as a child, who knows the particular way he laughed, who can recall the stories he told about his own parents. When she dies, those memories will vanish. Her children knew their grandfather, but they knew him old and diminished. The man he was in his full strength exists now only in her, and she is aging. In 2 generations, perhaps 3, no one will remember that he existed at all. His grave will go untended. His name will appear on no lips. The chain of memory that connects each generation to those before it will have broken, as it breaks for everyone eventually. Even the famous are forgotten. Ozymandias built monuments that were supposed to last forever, and now only fragments remain in the desert, mocking his ambition. Nothing beside remains. But perhaps this is too sentimental. Perhaps the problem is not that we are forgotten, but that we were never significant to begin with. The Earth is one planet among hundreds of billions in a single galaxy, and there are hundreds of billions of galaxies. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old, and it will continue for trillions of years after the last star burns out. Human civilization has existed for perhaps 10,000 years, a flicker, less than a flicker, a rounding error in cosmic time. If every human achievement were erased tomorrow, the universe would proceed exactly as before. The laws of physics would not change. The galaxies would not pause. Nothing in the structure of reality would be different. This is not pessimism, it is arithmetic. And yet we proceed as if our lives matter immensely. We fall in love. We build careers. We raise children. We sacrifice for ideals. We grieve when we lose what we love. We plan for futures we may not see. We act as if our choices have weight, as if the distinction between a good life and a bad one is meaningful, as if there is something it would be better to do with our time rather than something worse. This behavior makes sense if our lives have genuine significance. But what if they do not? What if the sense of meaning that pervades our experience is an illusion, a trick of evolution that helped our ancestors survive but corresponds to nothing real? This is the question that seized the 19th century and shattered the 20th. It lurks beneath every other question we ask about how to live. What should I do with my life? The question assumes there is something I ought to do, some purpose that would be better fulfilled than neglected. But if the universe has no purposes, where does the ought come from? Why should I be moral? The question assumes that morality has some claim on us, that acting rightly matters in some way that acting wrongly does not. But if nothing ultimately matters, what difference does it make whether I help my neighbour or harm him, whether I keep my promises or break them, whether I live with integrity or deception? What gives my life meaning? The question assumes there is meaning to be found or created, that some ways of living are more meaningful than others. But on what basis? By whose authority? The universe is silent. Some people never confront these questions. They are born into traditions that provide ready answers, and they never step outside those traditions long enough to wonder whether the answers are true. This is not a criticism. A person can live a rich and admirable life without ever questioning the framework that makes it possible. But some people do question. Some people find themselves, through temperament or circumstance, unable to accept inherited meanings without examining them. And when they examine them, the foundations begin to crack. A man wakes in the middle of the night with a sudden conviction that everything he has spent his life pursuing is arbitrary. His career, his relationships, his values, all of it chosen, but chosen for no ultimate reason. He could have chosen differently, and it would not have mattered. He tries to shake off the feeling, but it persists. In the morning, he goes through his routines, but they feel hollow, performed by someone else. He looks at the people around him and wonders if they feel it too, or if they have somehow escaped. The feeling fades after a few days, but it leaves a residue. He knows now that the question exists. He knows that his sense of purpose rests on foundations he cannot see, and that when he looked for those foundations, he found nothing solid. This is not an argument, it is an experience. The arguments come later. For now, the question is simply this: what if the experience is accurate? What if beneath the busy surface of human life there is nothing but void? What if the meanings we live by are projections onto a blank screen, and the screen itself is empty? There is a scene in the work of a 19th century philosopher that captures this moment. A madman runs through the marketplace in the bright morning, carrying a lantern, crying out that he is looking for God. The people in the market, many of them no longer believers, laugh at him. Has God gotten lost? Did he wander off like a child? Is he hiding? The madman fixes them with his eyes. God is dead, he tells them. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But this tremendous event has not yet reached their ears. The deed is still more distant from them than the farthest stars, and yet they have done it themselves. The crowd does not understand. They think he is talking about religion, about belief in a supernatural being, but the madman knows something they do not yet grasp. He is not talking about whether people go to church. He is talking about the foundation on which their entire civilization rests. For centuries, God was the guarantor of meaning, of truth, of value. Even those who did not believe in God lived in a world whose structures had been shaped by belief. Now that foundation is crumbling, and nothing has risen to replace it. The highest values are devaluing themselves. The question why has no final answer. The madman knows that he has come too early. The people in the marketplace are not ready to hear what has happened. They will go on living as before, enjoying their comforts, pursuing their pleasures, unaware that they are walking on air. But eventually they will look down. This is where we begin. Not with definitions or histories or the careful distinctions of academic philosophy, but with the weight of the question itself. Something has happened in the history of human thought. A possibility has opened up that cannot easily be closed. The chapters that follow will trace how this possibility emerged, who articulated it most powerfully, and what responses have been offered. But before we proceed, we must feel the force of what is at stake. If nihilism is true, if life has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value, then everything we do is ultimately pointless. And if everything we do is ultimately pointless, we must decide what to do with that knowledge. We must decide how to live in the absence of cosmic justification. We must decide whether to despair or to carry on, and if we carry on what basis? The question is not whether we will answer it. The question is whether we can bear to ask it. The word nihilism derives from the Latin nihil, meaning nothing. In its broadest sense, nihilism is the philosophical position that something we ordinarily assume to exist or to have value does not exist or has no value. The term has been applied to many different claims: that knowledge is impossible, that truth is an illusion, that moral distinctions are arbitrary, that political authority has no legitimacy, that the external world does not exist. Each of these positions has been called nihilism at various times by various thinkers. But the form of nihilism that concerns us here is more specific and more troubling. Existential nihilism is the claim that life has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. The word inherent is crucial. Existential nihilism does not necessarily deny that we can create meaning for ourselves, that we can find activities worthwhile, or that we can live lives we consider valuable. What it denies is that any such meaning exists independently of our attitudes and choices. On the nihilist view, the universe does not come pre-equipped with purposes. It does not contain, built into its structure, any facts about what we ought to do or what would make our lives significant. If meaning exists at all, it exists only because we project it onto a world that is itself meaningless. This distinction between inherent meaning and created meaning marks the boundary between nihilism and its alternatives. A traditional religious worldview holds that meaning is inherent in the nature of things. God created the universe for a purpose, and human beings have a place in that purpose. Our lives are significant because they participate in a cosmic drama that existed before us and will continue after us. On this view, meaning is discovered, not invented. It is there whether we recognize it or not, and our task is to align ourselves with it. Nihilism rejects this picture. It holds that if we look at the universe without projection or wishful thinking, we find no such purpose written into its fabric. The universe simply is. It does not care about us because it cannot care about anything. Our sense that life matters is a psychological fact about human beings, not a metaphysical fact about reality. But nihilism is also distinct from positions that accept the absence of cosmic meaning while insisting that created meaning is genuine and sufficient. Many contemporary philosophers hold that the question of inherent meaning is misguided, that asking whether the universe has a purpose is like asking what color jealousy is. On this view, meaning is a category that applies to human lives and human activities, not to the cosmos as a whole. My life can be meaningful because of my relationships, my projects, and my values, and this meaning is real even if no God underwrites it. Nihilism, in its strongest form, questions whether created meaning is enough. If the meanings we construct are arbitrary, if I could have constructed different meanings with equal justification, then in what sense are they really meaningful? If nothing grounds my values except my having chosen them, and I could have chosen otherwise, then my values seem to rest on nothing at all. This is the tension at the heart of the nihilist challenge. We cannot live without purposes. Human beings are constitutionally incapable of treating everything as equally worthless. Even the person who claims to believe that nothing matters still acts as if some things matter more than others. He eats when he is hungry. He avoids pain. He maintains relationships. His behavior reveals commitments that his philosophy denies. But this observation, while true, does not answer the nihilist. The nihilist can acknowledge that we cannot help acting as if our lives matter while insisting that, from a sufficiently detached perspective, they do not. Our inability to live without meaning does not prove that meaning exists. It may simply prove that we are incapable of facing the truth. Nihilism as a philosophical position must be distinguished from nihilism as a cultural diagnosis. When Nietzsche wrote about nihilism, he was not primarily advocating a philosophical thesis. He was describing a historical condition. The values that had organized European civilization for 2,000 years were collapsing. The belief in God, in objective truth, in moral absolutes, these had lost their grip on educated people, and nothing had emerged to replace them. The result was a spiritual crisis. People continued to go through the motions, but the faith that had animated those motions was gone. They were living on borrowed capital, using moral and philosophical currencies that had been devalued. Nietzsche called this condition nihilism not because he endorsed it, but because he diagnosed it. His project was to understand how it had arisen and to ask what might come next. The distinction between diagnosis and advocacy matters because nihilism is often misunderstood. The thinkers who wrote most penetratingly about nihilism were not, for the most part, nihilists themselves. Dostoevsky gave the nihilist position its most powerful expression through characters like Ivan Karamazov and the Underground Man, but Dostoevsky was a devout Christian who regarded nihilism as a spiritual catastrophe. Nietzsche diagnosed the death of God with unparalleled clarity, but his project was to overcome nihilism, not to celebrate it. Camus articulated the absurdity of human existence, but his philosophy was a response to absurdity, an attempt to live fully in its presence. Even Schopenhauer, the great pessimist whose influence pervades this entire tradition, did not accept meaninglessness as the final word. He sought escape through aesthetic contemplation and the denial of the will. The history of nihilism is largely a history of thinkers wrestling with a problem they did not want to accept. There are other forms of nihilism that border on the existential variety without being identical to it. Moral nihilism holds that there are no objective moral truths, that when we say something is right or wrong, good or evil, we are expressing our attitudes rather than describing reality. This position is compatible with believing that life has meaning. One might hold that life is meaningful because of love, or beauty, or creativity, while denying that moral claims are objectively true. Epistemological nihilism, or radical skepticism, holds that knowledge is impossible, that we can never be certain of anything, including our own existence. Cosmic nihilism focuses specifically on the scale of the universe and our insignificance within it. These forms of nihilism overlap with existential nihilism but are not reducible to it. One can be a moral nihilist without being an existential nihilist, or vice versa. The existential form is defined by its specific claim that life has no inherent meaning, purpose, or value. This claim can be understood in stronger and weaker versions. The strong version holds that life has no meaning whatsoever, that not only is there no cosmic purpose, but even the meanings we create for ourselves are illusory. On this view, when I say that my relationship with my children gives my life meaning, I am deceiving myself. There is no such thing as meaning, only the feeling of meaning, and feelings are not evidence of anything beyond themselves. The weaker version holds that while there is no inherent meaning, the meanings we create are genuine. On this view, my relationship with my children really does give my life meaning, not because the universe cares about it, but because I care about it, and that caring is real. The strong version leads toward despair or numbness. The weak version opens space for what might be called existentialist affirmation, the project of constructing a meaningful life in full awareness that the meanings are our own creation. The chapters that follow will explore how this problem emerged historically, who articulated it most forcefully, and what responses have been offered. We will begin with the ancient and medieval background, where questions of meaning were posed but answered within frameworks that no longer command assent. We will trace the slow cracking of those frameworks in the modern period, leading to the 19th century crisis when nihilism fully emerged. We will examine the great diagnosticians, Schopenhauer, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, who saw what was happening before most of their contemporaries. We will explore the existentialist responses of the 20th century, Heidegger's confrontation with the nothing, Sartre's radical freedom, Camus' philosophy of the absurd. And we will consider where the question stands today, after a century of further development and no final resolution. But first, we must understand how we arrived at this pass. Nihilism did not appear from nowhere. It emerged from specific historical conditions, from the breakdown of specific beliefs, from the failure of specific projects as to ground human meaning in something solid. The next chapter traces that history. The question of whether life has meaning did not originate in the 19th century. Human beings have always wondered about their place in the cosmos, about death, about whether their sufferings and joys amount to anything. But for most of human history, these questions were posed within frameworks that provided answers. The frameworks differed: Greek, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, Hindu, Buddhist, Confucian, but each offered an account of why we are here and what we are supposed to do about it. Nihilism in its modern form became possible only when these frameworks lost their grip, when the answers they provided could no longer be accepted without question. The history of nihilism is therefore also a history of doubt. The ancient Greek skeptics raised many of the questions that would later haunt modern philosophy. Pyrrho of Elis, in the 4th century before the Common Era, taught that we can know nothing with certainty about the nature of things. Our senses deceive us. Our reasoning contradicts itself. For every argument there is an equal and opposite argument. The proper response to this situation, Pyrrho held, was suspension of judgment. We should not commit ourselves to any belief about how things really are. This suspension of judgment would bring tranquility, freedom from the anxiety that comes from caring too much about matters we cannot resolve. Later skeptics in the Academy and the Pyrrhonist tradition developed these arguments with great sophistication, producing catalogues of the ways in which knowledge claims could be doubted. But Greek skepticism was not nihilism. The skeptics did not conclude that life has no meaning. They concluded that we should stop worrying about questions we cannot answer and live according to custom and nature. Their doubt was therapeutic, aimed at producing peace of mind, not existential crisis. Moreover, the skeptical challenge was local to philosophy. Most people went about their lives untroubled by arguments about the reliability of the senses. The social and religious frameworks that gave life meaning remained intact. One could doubt whether we truly know that fire is hot while still participating fully in the rituals and relationships that structured ancient life. A different kind of questioning appeared in the Hebrew wisdom tradition. The Book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to King Solomon, contains passages that sound startlingly modern. "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher, "vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit has a man from all his labour in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever." The Hebrew word translated as vanity is hevel, which literally means breath or vapour, something insubstantial, transient, empty. The preacher surveys human achievements and finds them all hevel. Wisdom is better than folly, but the wise man dies just like the fool. Pleasure is enjoyable while it lasts, but it does not last. Wealth accumulates, but we cannot take it with us. The preacher has seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and grasping for the wind. This is not nihilism either, or not quite. Ecclesiastes is a religious text, and its pessimism is framed by faith. The preacher's conclusion is not that life is meaningless, but that human striving apart from God is meaningless. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. The emptiness the preacher describes is the emptiness of a life lived under the sun, a life confined to the natural world without reference to the divine. The text diagnoses the problem but also implies the solution. Meaning comes from beyond the human sphere, from the Creator who gives the world its purpose. Within a theistic framework, the pessimism of Ecclesiastes becomes a warning against idolatry, against placing ultimate value in things that cannot bear ultimate weight. The medieval Christian synthesis took this framework to its fullest development. In the Thomistic worldview, which dominated European thought for centuries, existence was organized by purpose. God had created the universe for a reason, and every creature had its proper place and function. Human beings were made in the image of God and ordered toward a supernatural end: beatitude, the vision of God, eternal life. Our purpose was given, not chosen. We did not have to construct meaning. We had to discover it, to align our wills with the divine will, to become what we were created to be. This worldview was extraordinarily robust. It could accommodate doubt and suffering because it placed them within a larger narrative that made sense of them. Evil existed, but it would be overcome. Death was real, but it was a passage to eternal life. The individual's existence might seem fleeting and insignificant, but it participated in a cosmic drama of creation, fall, and redemption. The breakdown of this synthesis is one of the great stories of Western history, and it cannot be reduced to a single cause or a single moment. The Protestant Reformation fractured the unity of Christendom and introduced the principle that individuals could interpret Scripture for themselves without the mediation of an authoritative church. The scientific revolution revealed a universe vastly larger and older than anyone had imagined, operating according to mechanical laws that made no reference to purpose or design. The wars of religion that devastated Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries raised urgent practical questions about how people with different beliefs could live together, leading to new ideas about toleration and the separation of church and state. Each of these developments and others contributed to the weakening of the traditional framework. The Enlightenment offered a new foundation: reason. If revelation could not be trusted, perhaps reason could provide what faith no longer could. The Great Enlightenment projects, science, political reform, moral philosophy, all proceeded on the assumption that rational inquiry could discover objective truth, including truths about value. The universe might not have been created by a benevolent God, but it was still a lawful cosmos that could be understood and improved. Human beings might not have immortal souls, but they had natural rights and rational capacities that made them worthy of respect. The death of the old God would be followed by the birth of new values: liberty, equality, progress, humanity. But could reason actually do the work that had been assigned to it? This was the question that Hume raised in the 18th century, and that Kant tried to answer. Hume pointed out that reason alone cannot establish values. From purely factual premises about how things are, we cannot derive conclusions about how things ought to be. This is sometimes called Hume's guillotine, or the is-ought problem, and it remains a fundamental challenge for any purely secular ethics. Kant attempted to ground morality in reason itself, arguing that rational beings are necessarily committed to treating humanity as an end in itself, never merely as a means. But Kant's moral philosophy, for all its rigour, has always had critics who doubt whether it can generate the concrete guidance that earlier frameworks provided. Meanwhile, the cosmos disclosed by modern science seemed increasingly indifferent to human concerns. Copernicus removed the Earth from the centre of the universe. Darwin explained the emergence of life through a process that had no design and no purpose. The universe revealed by physics was governed by blind mechanical forces, not by providence or teleology. If there was a God, he had withdrawn from the scene, leaving a clockwork cosmos that ran on its own. The ancient question, why is there something rather than nothing, remained unanswered. But the traditional answer, because God willed it so, for purposes we can partially understand, was no longer available to educated people. By the 19th century, the cracks in certainty had become chasms. The old frameworks had lost their authority, and the new ones had not delivered on their promises. The Enlightenment faith in progress was shaken by the horrors of industrialization, child labor, urban squalor, colonial exploitation. The Enlightenment faith in reason was shaken by thinkers like Schopenhauer, who argued that reason was the servant of irrational will, not its master. The whole edifice of Western civilization seemed to be teetering on a foundation that had quietly been removed. This was the situation Nietzsche diagnosed when he declared that God was dead and we had killed him. The death of God was not primarily a theological claim about the existence of a supernatural being. It was a cultural diagnosis. The foundations of meaning had collapsed and nothing had risen to replace them. The stage was now set for nihilism in its fullest form. The old answers were gone. The new answers were not convincing. And a generation of thinkers would be forced to confront, more honestly than anyone had before, the possibility that the question of meaning might have no answer at all. Arthur Schopenhauer was born in Danzig in 1788 and spent much of his adult life in obscurity, raging against the neglect of his work while the German philosophical establishment celebrated Hegel. Recognition came only in his final years, after he had spent decades developing a systematic philosophy that placed suffering at the center of existence. Schopenhauer was not a nihilist in the strict sense. He believed that escape from the misery of life was possible through aesthetic contemplation and the denial of the will, but his pessimism laid the groundwork for everything that followed. Nietzsche began as a disciple of Schopenhauer before turning against him. Dostoevsky read him and trembled. The entire tradition of existential thought passes through his shadow. Schopenhauer's central insight was that beneath the world of representation, the world as it appears to us, organized by space, time, and causality, there lies a fundamental reality he called the will. This will is not a person or a deity with intentions and purposes. It is a blind, purposeless striving that manifests itself in everything that exists. The force that drives a plant to grow toward the light, the hunger that makes an animal chase its prey, the desire that makes human beings struggle and scheme, all of these are expressions of the same underlying will. The world is will, and the will is everywhere and always the same. Ceaseless striving, without rest or satisfaction. From this metaphysical picture, Schopenhauer drew devastating conclusions about human life. We are, each of us, embodiments of will. Our most fundamental experience is wanting. Wanting food, wanting warmth, wanting sex, wanting status, wanting love, wanting meaning. But what happens when we get what we want? A brief moment of satisfaction, followed almost immediately by new wants. The will cannot be satisfied because satisfaction would be its cessation, and the will by its nature never ceases. We are thus caught in an endless cycle. We suffer when we want and are not satisfied, and we suffer differently, through boredom and emptiness, when we have nothing left to want. There is no stable resting point, no plateau of contentment. Life oscillates between pain and boredom, and what we call happiness is merely the temporary absence of pain. Consider the life of any individual. Birth is a kind of catastrophe, an entry into a world of need. Childhood is spent acquiring the skills necessary for survival. Youth is consumed by passion and ambition, by desperate grasping for success in love or work or reputation. Middle age brings the realization that the prizes we sought were not what we imagined, that satisfaction remains elusive, that we have traded our youth for achievements that do not satisfy. Old age brings decline, the loss of powers, the narrowing of possibilities, and finally death, which cancels everything. The will drove us forward our entire lives, and at the end it discards us like a tool that has served its purpose. What was it all for? Schopenhauer surveyed human institutions and found the same pattern everywhere. Sex is the will's most urgent expression, the imperative to reproduce, to continue the species, to perpetuate suffering into the next generation. Romantic love is the will's cleverest trick. We are made to believe that another person is uniquely precious, uniquely necessary to our happiness, when in fact we are simply being manipulated by biological forces that care nothing for our well-being. The lover believes he is pursuing his own individual happiness, but he is merely a pawn of the species, a vehicle for the transmission of life. The children born from such unions will in turn suffer, want, struggle, and die, and the will continues, indifferent to the fates of its particular embodiments. Art offered Schopenhauer a temporary respite. When we contemplate a beautiful painting or listen to great music, we momentarily escape the tyranny of the will. We become pure subjects of knowledge, perceiving the world without wanting anything from it. This state of aesthetic contemplation is liberating precisely because it interrupts the endless cycle of desire and frustration. For a brief time, we are not servants of the will. We are disinterested observers, seeing things as they are rather than as objects of our need. But the respite is temporary. Eventually the will reasserts itself, and we are thrown back into the struggle. The only genuine escape, Schopenhauer believed, was the denial of the will, a turning away from desire, a renunciation of the cravings that constitute our ordinary existence. He found models for this in the ascetic traditions of Christianity and Hinduism, in the saints who mortified their flesh and the sages who withdrew from the world. The goal was not death, which is merely the destruction of the body, but something deeper, the extinction of the will to live itself. The person who achieves this state no longer strives, no longer wants, no longer suffers. He has seen through the illusion of individual existence and recognized that separateness is a dream. The will that drives him is the same will that drives everything. There is ultimately no distinction between self and other, and the compassion that arises from this recognition leads naturally to renunciation. This vision is bleak, and Schopenhauer did not soften it. He despised the optimists who claimed that this was the best of all possible worlds, mocking the philosophy of Leibniz with bitter sarcasm. If this is the best possible world, he asked, what would the worst one look like? He surveyed the catalogue of human suffering, disease, poverty, war, betrayal, loneliness, madness, and found it inexhaustible. He observed the natural world, red in tooth and claw, and saw not harmony but endless predation. Life is given to no one for possession, to all for use, he wrote, and the use consists largely of being consumed by forces beyond our control. Schopenhauer's influence on subsequent thought was profound. Nietzsche discovered him as a young man and was immediately captivated, later saying that Schopenhauer was one of the few thinkers who had the courage to look at life honestly. But Nietzsche eventually turned against his teacher, arguing that Schopenhauer's rejection of life was itself a symptom of decline, a retreat from the challenges of existence. The affirmation of life that Nietzsche championed was explicitly constructed against the Schopenhauerian background. Wagner based his operas on Schopenhauerian themes: the world as will, the redemption through denial, the link between eros and death. Freud's concept of the unconscious owes much to Schopenhauer's account of the will as the hidden driver of behavior. Tolstoy was shaken by Schopenhauer's pessimism and struggled for years to find an answer to it. But Schopenhauer's most important contribution to the history of nihilism was not any particular argument. It was his demonstration that pessimism could be serious philosophy. Before Schopenhauer, it was easy to dismiss dark views of life as the products of bad digestion or disappointed ambition. After Schopenhauer, such dismissals were no longer available. He had constructed a systematic worldview grounded in Kant's epistemology and consistent with the findings of natural science that placed suffering and meaninglessness at the heart of existence. You might disagree with him, but you could not ignore him. He had opened a door that could not easily be closed. The room beyond that door was airless and dark. In the next chapter, we will see how the word nihilism itself entered European consciousness, through a Russian novel that captured the mood of an era. The word nihilist entered European consciousness in 1862, when Ivan Turgenev published his novel Fathers and Sons. The book tells the story of Bazarov, a young medical student who returns to the Russian countryside and scandalizes the older generation with his radical views. Bazarov calls himself a nihilist, and when pressed to explain what he means, he replies, "A nihilist is a person who does not bow down to any authority, who does not accept any principle on faith, however much that principle may be revered." The older characters are horrified. "What will you do," they ask, "if you reject everything?" Bazarov's answer is blunt. First, we must clear the ground. Whether to build anything on the cleared ground is a question for later. Turgenev had captured something real. A generation of young Russians was in revolt against the traditions of their fathers, not just political traditions, though those too, but the entire structure of inherited belief. The Orthodox Church, the autocratic state, the romantic idealism that had animated the previous generation, all of it was being rejected in favor of a harder, colder worldview based on materialism and utility. The nihilists were not simply atheists, they were materialists who believed that only matter and force were real, that consciousness was an epiphenomenon of brain activity, that appeals to morality or beauty or spiritual value were mystifications. They were not simply political radicals. They were determined to rebuild society on rational principles without deference to custom or sentiment. This Russian nihilism was as much a sensibility as a doctrine. The young radicals cultivated an ethos of bluntness, refusing the polite evasions of civilized society. They rejected aesthetic refinement as an aristocratic distraction. They shocked their elders by their crudeness, their materialism, their refusal to pretend respect for things they did not respect. Bazarov in Turgenev's novel dissects frogs and speaks of human beings in purely physiological terms. His friend Arkady is drawn to nihilism but cannot fully commit. He still wants love, beauty, meaning. Bazarov dies of typhus, infected while performing an autopsy, and his final hours complicate the reader's picture of him. Was he as cold as he claimed to be? Did he regret his nihilism at the end? The novel does not offer easy answers. The political implications of nihilism were soon realized. If existing authority has no legitimacy, why not overthrow it? If traditional morality is mere superstition, why not use any means necessary to achieve political goals? The nihilist movement evolved into revolutionary movements, some of which embraced terrorism. In 1881, members of the People's Will assassinated Tsar Alexander II. The line from philosophical nihilism to political violence was not necessary. One could reject inherited values without bombing trains, but the connection was there, and it worried those who thought about where ideas lead. Dostoevsky was one of those worried observers. He had been a revolutionary in his youth, arrested in 1849 for his participation in a utopian socialist circle. He was sentenced to death, and the sentence was carried out up to the final moments. The prisoners were lined up before the firing squad, before a last-minute reprieve commuted the punishment to imprisonment in Siberia. The experience transformed him. In the prison camp, Dostoevsky encountered the Russian peasantry and rediscovered the orthodox faith he had abandoned. He came to see the revolutionary atheism of his youth as a spiritual catastrophe, a tearing loose from the roots that gave life meaning. But Dostoevsky was not a simple reactionary. His genius was to take the nihilist position seriously, to give it voice through characters who argued it with terrifying cogency. He did not refute nihilism by ignoring it or caricaturing it. He let it speak, and then he showed where it led. His novels are battlegrounds where faith and doubt, meaning and meaninglessness fight for the soul. The faith that eventually emerges from this combat is not naive or untested. It has passed through the fire of nihilism and survived. Whether it survives intact, or whether the nihilist voices have the better of the argument, is a question readers have debated ever since. Fathers and Sons was published in the year Dostoevsky was released from exile. The word nihilism spread quickly across Europe, naming a phenomenon that had been growing but lacked a label. Within a decade, Nietzsche would be using the term in his notebooks, giving it the philosophical weight it had previously lacked. The Russian context gave way to a broader European crisis. The question that Bazarov posed, what happens when we stop believing in everything, became the question of an era. But the fullest exploration of that question came from Dostoevsky himself. In the next chapter we turn to his great novels, where nihilism finds its most eloquent and disturbing expression. In the winter of 1866, Fyodor Dostoevsky published Crime and Punishment in serial form. The novel follows Raskolnikov, a former student living in poverty in St. Petersburg, who commits a double murder and spends the rest of the book suffering under the weight of his crime. Raskolnikov is not a common criminal. He kills the pawnbroker Alyona Ivanovna because he has convinced himself that extraordinary men are not bound by ordinary morality. Napoleon caused the deaths of thousands, and history calls him great. Why should Raskolnikov not be permitted to step over the law if his ends are noble and his capacities superior? The murder will prove that he belongs to the class of men who shape history rather than being shaped by it. But Raskolnikov cannot sustain his theory in the face of experience. The murder haunts him. He wanders the streets of Petersburg in a fever, unable to enjoy the freedom he has supposedly won. He is drawn repeatedly to the scene of the crime, drawn to confess, drawn to the pure-hearted prostitute Sonia, who reads him the story of Lazarus raised from the dead. In the end, he confesses and is sent to Siberia, where, in the epilogue, the possibility of spiritual rebirth is glimpsed but not fully realized. The crime was easy, the punishment is living with what he has done. Raskolnikov's theory is a form of nihilism. If there are no moral absolutes, if morality is merely a convention that binds the weak while the strong step over it, then the prohibition against murder loses its force. You might still refrain from killing out of prudence or squeamishness, but you cannot say that killing is wrong in any ultimate sense. Dostoevsky shows that this theory cannot be lived. Raskolnikov believes it intellectually, but his organism rebels against it. The suffering he experiences is not imposed externally. It wells up from within, as if his own nature testifies against his philosophy. Notes from Underground, published 2 years earlier, goes further. The underground man is not a criminal, but a petty bureaucrat living in a St. Petersburg basement, writing a confession that no one will read. He is spite incarnate, a man who takes pleasure in frustrating his own desires, who refuses to be happy because happiness would mean submitting to rational order. The utopian socialists of his time promised a future where all human needs would be satisfied, where reason would organize society for maximum welfare. The underground man despises this vision. What if, he asks, human beings do not want to be happy. What if they want to assert their will, even against their own interests, simply to prove that they are not piano keys to be played by rational laws? The Crystal Palace was the name given to the iron and glass exhibition hall built in London for the Great Exhibition of 1851, and it became a symbol for the utopian future that progressive thinkers imagined. Everything planned, everything efficient, everything rational. The underground man sees in this vision the abolition of freedom. If science can predict all human behaviour, if every desire can be calculated and satisfied, then we are merely mechanisms, sophisticated mechanisms, but mechanisms nonetheless. The underground man refuses. He will do something irrational, something self-destructive, just to prove that he is not a mechanism. And what if it so happens, he writes, that a man's advantage sometimes not only may, but even must, consist in desiring what is harmful to himself and not what is advantageous? This is nihilism of a peculiar sort. The underground man does not deny that life has meaning. He denies that reason can capture it. The rationalists want to reduce human existence to a formula, 2 + 2 = 4, and the underground man would rather put out his tongue at the formula than accept it. His rebellion is futile and self-defeating, but it is rebellion nonetheless. He is protesting against a world that would make him predictable, and his protest takes the form of deliberate perversity. The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's final novel, brings these themes to their culmination. The novel tells the story of the Karamazov family, the dissolute father Fyodor, the passionate Dmitri, the intellectual Ivan, and the saintly Alyosha. The question of faith and doubt, meaning and meaninglessness, runs through every page. But the nihilist position finds its fullest expression in the chapters devoted to Ivan. Ivan Karamazov is not a nihilist in any simple sense. He does not deny God's existence. He admits that he might exist. What Ivan cannot accept is the world God has created. He tells Alyosha about the suffering of innocent children, children beaten by their parents, children hunted by dogs, children frozen to death in outhouses, and asks how any ultimate harmony could justify such suffering. Even if everything is made right in the end, Ivan says, what about the tears of that one child? Those tears have not been redeemed, and no future paradise can redeem them. I don't want harmony, Ivan declares. From love for humanity, I don't want it. I would rather be left with the unavenged suffering. I would rather remain with my unavenged suffering and unsatisfied indignation, even if I were wrong. This is not an argument against God's existence, but against his goodness. Ivan returns his ticket. He refuses to participate in any scheme that requires the suffering of innocence as its price. And from this rebellion follows the famous formula, if there is no God, everything is permitted. If there is no ultimate meaning, no final judgment, no cosmic order that underwrites morality, then we are left without foundations. The prohibition against murder becomes merely a human convention, as Raskolnikov discovered. The distinction between good and evil becomes a matter of taste or power. Ivan articulates this position, but he does not live it. The one who lives it is Smerdyakov, the epileptic servant who is probably Fyodor Karamazov's illegitimate son. Smerdyakov takes Ivan's philosophy and acts on it, murdering the father that Ivan secretly wished dead. When Smerdyakov reveals what he has done, explaining that he was merely putting Ivan's ideas into practice, Ivan is shattered. He had thought of himself as a thinker, playing with dangerous ideas in the safety of the intellect. Smerdyakov shows him what those ideas mean when taken seriously. But the philosophical heart of the novel is the chapter called The Grand Inquisitor, a story Ivan tells Alyosha as a kind of prose poem. In the story, Christ returns to earth in 16th century Seville during the height of the Inquisition. He walks through the streets, blessing the people, healing the sick, raising the dead. The people recognize him and flock to him. But the Grand Inquisitor, the old cardinal who has been burning heretics by the hundreds, sees Christ and has him arrested. That night the Inquisitor visits Christ in his cell and delivers a monologue that runs for many pages. The Inquisitor's argument is that Christ made a mistake. In the wilderness, the devil offered Jesus 3 temptations: turn stones into bread, throw yourself from the temple, and rule all the kingdoms of the world. Jesus rejected all 3. But in doing so, the Inquisitor argues, he placed a burden on humanity that humanity cannot bear. He offered freedom, the freedom to choose faith without proof, without miracle, without earthly reward. But human beings do not want freedom. They want bread. They want miracle. They want authority to tell them what to do. Christ's gift was too great for so weak a creature as man. The Church, the Inquisitor explains, has corrected Christ's error. It has taken upon itself the burden that he refused, accepting the devil's 3 temptations in order to give humanity what it actually needs. The Church provides bread through its temporal power. It provides miracle through its rituals and relics. It provides authority through its dogmas and disciplines. The people are not free, but they are happy, or at least content, which is all they can manage. And at the end, they will die peacefully, with the name of Christ on their lips, never knowing that their church has betrayed him. Christ says nothing throughout this speech. When the Inquisitor finishes, expecting rebuke or denunciation, Christ simply rises and kisses him gently on his bloodless lips. The Inquisitor shudders but lets him go, telling him never to return. The kiss burns in his heart, but he holds to his idea. What is Dostoevsky saying? The Inquisitor's argument is nihilism dressed in ecclesiastical robes. It holds that the truth is too terrible for most people, that the masses need lies to live, that a wise elite must manage the illusions that keep society functioning. There is no God, or if there is, his gifts are useless to humanity. Meaning must be manufactured, distributed in careful doses by those who know that meaning is manufactured. This is the logic of Ivan's rebellion taken to its institutional conclusion. But Dostoevsky does not endorse this view. The kiss is Christ's answer, a gesture of love that refuses argument, that meets the Inquisitor's despair with compassion rather than dialectic. Whether this answer is sufficient, whether love can really overcome the objections that Ivan and the Inquisitor have raised, is the question the novel leaves with its readers. Dostoevsky believed it could, but he gave the nihilist position such power that many readers have found it the more convincing voice. The challenge Dostoevsky poses is this: if there is no God, if there is no cosmic order that guarantees meaning and morality, then we are left with either the paralysis of Ivan or the cynicism of the Inquisitor. We can suffer under the weight of meaninglessness, or we can manage meaninglessness for the benefit of the herd. What we cannot do, apparently, is escape the dilemma. Dostoevsky's answer was faith, not easy faith, but faith that has passed through the crucible of doubt. Whether that answer satisfies is another matter. In the 3rd book of The Gay Science, published in 1882, Friedrich Nietzsche tells the story of a madman who lights a lantern in the bright morning hours, runs to the marketplace, and cries incessantly, "I seek God, I seek God." The people in the marketplace, many of whom do not believe in God, find this hilarious. Has God gotten lost? Is he hiding? Did he emigrate? The madman leaps into their midst and pierces them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cries. "I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? The crowd stares in silence. The madman throws his lantern to the ground, where it breaks and goes out. "I have come too early," he says. "My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves." This passage is not an argument for atheism. Nietzsche was not trying to prove that God does not exist. He was describing something that had already happened. The God who had served as the foundation of Western morality, Western truth, Western meaning, was no longer believable. The educated classes had abandoned him, quietly, almost without noticing. They continued to live by Christian values: compassion, equality, humility. But the metaphysical ground on which those values rested had been removed. They were using currency that had been devalued, spending the capital of a faith they no longer held. The death of God for Nietzsche was not primarily a theological event. It was a cultural catastrophe whose consequences had not yet been understood. When God dies, everything that depended on God dies with him. Truth itself becomes questionable because the very concept of objective truth was bound up with the idea of a divine perspective from which reality could be seen as it really is. Morality becomes questionable because the moral law was supposed to express the will of a lawgiver who no longer exists. Purpose and meaning become questionable because the cosmos was supposed to be the creation of a mind with intentions. Strip away God, and you strip away the foundations on which the entire edifice of Western civilization was built. Nietzsche saw that most of his contemporaries had not grasped this. They thought they could reject Christianity while keeping Christian morality, the democratic ideals, the compassion for the weak, the belief in human equality. Nietzsche found this naive. These values made sense within a Christian framework, where every soul was precious to God and where the last would be first. Outside that framework, what grounds them? Why should the strong not dominate the weak? Why should compassion take precedence over excellence? The secular liberals and socialists of Nietzsche's day were living on borrowed capital, assuming values they could no longer justify. This diagnosis appears throughout Nietzsche's later works. In Twilight of the Idols, he writes, "When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet." In the genealogy of morals, he traces the origin of moral concepts to historical power struggles, showing how good and evil acquired their meanings through processes that had nothing to do with divine command or natural law. In Beyond Good and Evil, he calls for a revaluation of all values, a fundamental reassessment of what we have been taught to consider good and bad, noble and base. The old tablets must be smashed before new ones can be written. But Nietzsche was not a nihilist in the sense of someone who accepts meaninglessness and stops there. His project was to overcome nihilism, not to wallow in it. He distinguished between passive and active nihilism. Passive nihilism is the nihilism of exhaustion, the reaction of those who, finding that their highest values have lost their force, sink into despair or comfortable mediocrity. The last man that Nietzsche describes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the embodiment of passive nihilism, a creature who has given up all aspiration, who wants nothing difficult, who blinks and says, "We have invented happiness," while avoiding everything that might disturb his comfort. Active nihilism, by contrast, is a destructive force that clears away the debris of dead values, making room for something new. Nietzsche wanted to move beyond nihilism altogether, to create new values that would affirm life rather than deny it. This is where concepts like the will to power, eternal recurrence, and the Übermensch enter his thought. The will to power is not, despite popular misunderstanding, a will to dominate others. It is the fundamental drive to grow, to overcome resistance, to expand and intensify life. Every organism, every process, every creative act expresses will to power. The artist who creates, the scientist who discovers, the athlete who pushes past previous limits, all are exercising will to power. It is not a merely aggressive force. It includes the power over oneself, the discipline and self-overcoming that make achievement possible. Nietzsche saw this will at work everywhere, in nature and in culture, and he sought to affirm it rather than deny it. Eternal recurrence is one of Nietzsche's most enigmatic ideas. He asks us to imagine that this life, exactly as we have lived it, with every pain and every joy, will recur infinitely, over and over again. The question is not whether this is literally true, but whether you could affirm it. Could you say yes to your life so completely that you would will its eternal repetition? Or would you shrink from the thought, wishing you had lived differently? Eternal recurrence is a test. It forces you to confront whether you are living a life you could affirm unconditionally. The Übermensch, variously translated as Overman, Superman, or Beyond Man, is the being who creates new values after the death of God. He is not a political dictator or a biological superior, but a spiritual achievement, one who has overcome the nihilism of the present age and created meaning through his own creative will. The Übermensch is contrasted with the last man, who represents the opposite response to the death of God. Where the last man settles for comfort and mediocrity, the Übermensch strives, creates, and affirms life even in the face of suffering. Whether Nietzsche succeeded in overcoming nihilism is debated. His thought is fragmentary, aphoristic, often contradictory. He never produced a systematic work that laid out his positive philosophy in full detail. His concept of the Übermensch remains vague, a gesture towards something that has not yet been realized rather than a concrete ideal, and his thought has been appropriated by forces he would have despised. The Nazis, in particular, twisted his ideas into a justification for atrocity, ignoring his explicit contempt for German nationalism and anti-Semitism. But Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism remains powerful. He saw clearly what many still refuse to see, that the collapse of religious belief was not a minor adjustment, but a world historical event whose consequences would take centuries to unfold. The ground had shifted beneath our feet, and we had not yet learned to walk on the new terrain. Whether his prescription, the creation of new values through heroic individual will, is adequate to the crisis is another matter. The next chapter will explore Nietzsche's attempt to move beyond nihilism and the questions it leaves unanswered. Nietzsche's famous aphorism appears in Beyond Good and Evil. He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. The abyss is nihilism, the void that opens when meaning collapses. Nietzsche's project was to gaze into that abyss without being destroyed by it, to find a way across rather than a way around. His distinction between passive and active nihilism marks two different responses to the crisis. Passive nihilism accepts the death of God and draws the conclusion that nothing matters. Since there is no cosmic purpose, the passive nihilist reasons, there is no point in striving. The appropriate response is to scale back ambition, to seek comfort rather than greatness, to avoid pain rather than pursue excellence. This is the nihilism of exhaustion, the response of those too weak or too weary to create new values. Nietzsche saw this passive nihilism spreading through European culture. The modern obsession with happiness, with avoiding suffering at all costs, with making life comfortable and safe, all of this struck him as symptomatic. The will to power had turned against itself, directing its energy toward minimizing life rather than intensifying it. People wanted to be left alone, wanted security, wanted distraction. They did not want greatness, because greatness requires suffering, and suffering had become the one thing modern humanity could not tolerate. The last man that Nietzsche describes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the ultimate expression of this tendency. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star? Asks the last man and blinks. He has no great desires, no great fears, no great achievements. He has invented happiness, a small, mean, anemic happiness that asks nothing and risks nothing. Everybody wants the same thing, everybody is the same. Whoever thinks otherwise goes voluntarily into the madhouse. The last man lives longest, Nietzsche notes with bitter irony. He survives because he does not expend himself in anything worth dying for. Active nihilism, by contrast, uses the destruction of old values as an opportunity. If God is dead and the old tablets are smashed, the active nihilist does not mourn but celebrates. Now we can begin again. Now we can create values that affirm life rather than deny it, that celebrate strength rather than weakness, that embrace existence in all its tragedy and beauty. Active nihilism is destructive, but it destroys in order to clear ground. It is the prerequisite for what Nietzsche calls the revaluation of all values. This revaluation requires understanding how the old values came to be. In the genealogy of morals, Nietzsche traces the origin of good and evil to historical power struggles between different types of people. The original meaning of good was simply noble, the self-affirmation of the strong, the healthy, the powerful. Bad meant common, low, plebeian. This was master morality, the morality of those who defined goodness by their own nature. But the slaves, the weak, the oppressed, created a counter-morality. Unable to compete with their masters on terms of strength and nobility, they redefined the terms. The strong were now evil, the weak good. Humility, meekness, submission, these became virtues. Pride, ambition, self-assertion, these became sins. This slave morality, born of resentment, triumphed through Christianity and now pervades Western culture. We think of it as simply morality, forgetting that it represents one possible valuation among many and not necessarily the best one. Nietzsche's point is not that we should return to brutal domination. He despises crude violence as much as Christian pity. His ideal is not the blonde beast of prey, but the self-overcoming individual who has internalized the struggle and uses it for creative purposes. The will to power, at its highest, is the will to master oneself, to discipline one's drives, to create out of chaos, to become who one is. This requires overcoming both the cruelty of the master and the servility of the slave, synthesizing both into something higher. The Übermensch is the name Nietzsche gives to this higher type. He is not a biological mutation or a political ruler, but a spiritual achievement, the human being who has passed through nihilism and come out the other side, creating new values through the power of his own will. The Übermensch does not need external validation. He does not seek the approval of the herd or the blessing of a god. He creates meaning through his own creative acts, and that meaning is sufficient because he wills it to be. But can meaning created by an individual will really be sufficient? This is the question that haunts Nietzsche's philosophy. If I create my own values, what makes them more than arbitrary preferences? If I affirm my life by my own choice, what makes that affirmation more than whistling in the dark? Nietzsche would respond that the demand for external validation is itself a symptom of weakness. The strong do not ask whether their values are approved by the cosmos. They create values and live by them, and that is enough. The concept of eternal recurrence intensifies this test. Imagine that you must live this life exactly as it has been, again and again, forever. Would you affirm it? Not just the good moments but the bad, not just the triumphs but the failures, not just the love but the loss. Everything, including the suffering, including the regret, including the moments you wish had never happened. Can you say yes to all of it? Most people, Nietzsche suspects, would shrink from this prospect. They would want to edit their lives, to keep the pleasures and remove the pains. But this, for Nietzsche, is a failure of affirmation. The person who can will eternal recurrence has achieved what he calls amor fati, love of fate, the unconditional acceptance of one's life as necessary and good. This is not resignation but active embrace. Not, I accept what cannot be changed, but I would have it no other way. Whether any human being can actually achieve this is doubtful. Nietzsche himself, afflicted by chronic illness and increasing isolation, did not present the picture of joyful affirmation his philosophy demands. His breakdown in 1889, when he collapsed in Turin while embracing a horse being beaten by its driver, has invited psychological speculation ever since. But the value of an idea does not depend on the life of its author. The question is whether Nietzsche's vision of overcoming nihilism is coherent and achievable, not whether Nietzsche himself achieved it. The difficulties are considerable. Nietzsche's thought is fragmentary and often contradictory. He never produced a systematic account of the new values he championed or explained how the Übermensch would live in concrete detail. His rhetoric of strength and weakness can easily be misappropriated by those who understand power only in terms of domination. His contempt for the herd, for democracy, for the common run of humanity, sits uneasily with democratic sensibilities. And there is a deeper problem. If all values are human creations, then Nietzsche's own values, the affirmation of life, the will to power, the ideal of the Übermensch, are also human creations. What privileges them over the values he attacks? Nietzsche would say that his values are better because they affirm life rather than deny it. But this criterion is itself one value among many. Why should affirmation of life be privileged over denial? Because Nietzsche values it. The circle seems vicious. These problems would occupy the thinkers who came after Nietzsche. The 20th century existentialists, Heidegger, Sartre, Camus, all began from the Nietzschean diagnosis, but sought different paths through the impasse. We turn to them in the chapters that follow. There is a kind of experience that comes unbidden, usually at quiet moments. You are going about your daily life, absorbed in tasks and relationships, when suddenly the whole structure seems to shift. The things that normally matter, your work, your plans, your relationships, suddenly seem arbitrary, contingent, held together by nothing more than habit and assumption. You step back from your own life and see it from the outside, and from that angle it appears strange, groundless, suspended over an abyss. The feeling passes usually. You return to your routines and forget. But something has been glimpsed. Martin Heidegger made this experience the centerpiece of his philosophy. He called it Angst, a German word that means anxiety, but not anxiety about anything in particular. We are afraid of dogs, or heights, or failure. But angst is not fear of any specific threat. It is the confrontation with the nothing that underlies all things, the recognition that the meanings we live by are not built into the structure of reality, but are sustained only by our own ongoing activity. Heidegger's major work, Being and Time, published in 1927, is one of the most difficult and influential books in 20th century philosophy. Its subject is the question of being, not this or that particular being, but being as such. What does it mean for something to exist? The question sounds abstract, but Heidegger insisted it was the most fundamental question we can ask, and that Western philosophy had largely forgotten it, covering it over with technical concerns about particular entities. Human beings, for Heidegger, have a distinctive relationship to this question. We do not simply exist, we are concerned about our existence. We ask what our lives mean, what we should do with them, who we are. Heidegger uses the term Dasein, literally being there, to refer to this peculiarly human way of existing. Dasein is not a thing among other things, but a being for whom its own being is an issue. Central to Dasein's existence is what Heidegger calls thrownness. We did not choose to exist. We did not choose the time or place of our birth, our parents, our bodies, our initial circumstances. We simply find ourselves already here, thrown into a world we did not make, with a past we did not choose, facing a future we cannot control. This thrownness is not a problem to be solved, but a basic condition of human existence. We are always already in the midst of things, dealing with a situation that we inherited rather than designed. Equally central is what Heidegger calls being toward death. Death is the one certain thing about human life, but it is certain in a peculiar way. We know we will die, but we do not know when or how. Death is always impending, always possible, but never present. And death is supremely individual. No one can die my death for me. In the face of death, all my projects and concerns are revealed as finite, contingent, ultimately futile. Death is the possibility that makes all other possibilities impossible, the horizon against which everything I do is silhouetted. Most of the time, we flee from this confrontation. Heidegger distinguishes between authentic and inauthentic existence. Inauthentic existence is the mode in which we are absorbed in the world, doing what one does, thinking what one thinks, avoiding the uncomfortable questions that lurk at the edges. The German word he uses is das Man, the they or the one. One goes to work, one raises a family, one follows the conventions. The self is lost in the public world, living according to standards it did not choose and rarely examines. This is not a moral failing. It is the default mode of human existence. We cannot be authentic all the time, but it is a falling away from the full possibilities of Dasein. Angst is the mood that breaks through the comfort of inauthentic existence. In angst, the familiar world becomes strange. The meanings that sustained our daily activity lose their grip, and we are confronted with the nothingness that underlies them. This is terrifying, but it is also liberating. Only in angst do we glimpse who we really are, stripped of the roles and identities we have adopted from Das Man. Only in angst do we confront our own mortality, our own freedom, our own responsibility for who we will become. Authentic existence, for Heidegger, means owning one's life. It means facing one's thrownness without resentment and facing one's death without evasion. It means choosing one's projects knowingly, understanding that they are finite and groundless, that the meanings they embody are sustained by one's own commitment rather than by any cosmic guarantee. The authentic individual does not cease to act or to care. He acts and cares with a different quality of awareness, a lucid acknowledgement of the conditions under which human existence unfolds. This account of authenticity influenced the existentialists who followed, particularly Sartre. But Heidegger himself was a controversial figure. In 1933, he joined the Nazi Party and delivered speeches celebrating the new regime. His involvement with Nazism has been debated ever since, whether it was opportunism, genuine conviction, or some mixture of both. After the war, Heidegger never clearly repudiated his earlier political commitments, and his silence has damaged his reputation. The relationship between his philosophy and his politics is complex. Some scholars find deep connections between his critique of modernity and his embrace of National Socialism. Others argue that Nazism was a betrayal of his own philosophical principles. What is clear is that Heidegger's thought cannot be straightforwardly appropriated for liberal or democratic purposes. His critique of technology, his suspicion of humanism, his emphasis on rootedness and authenticity, these themes have disturbing resonances with the rhetoric of fascism, even if they do not logically entail it. But the philosophical questions Heidegger raised about meaning, death, and authenticity remain important. The experience of angst, whatever we think of his account of it, is real. The question of how to live in the face of mortality, how to own one's existence rather than merely undergo it, does not go away because its most famous formulator was morally compromised. The next chapter turns to Sartre, who developed these themes in a different direction, insisting more strongly on human freedom and responsibility. Jean-Paul Sartre sat in a Paris café in 1933, listening to his friend Raymond Aron explain a new philosophy coming from Germany. Aron pointed to his glass and said, "You see, my dear fellow, if you are a phenomenologist, you can talk about this cocktail and make philosophy out of it." Sartre turned pale with emotion. This was what he had been looking for, a philosophy that would engage with concrete existence rather than abstract systems. He immediately began studying Husserl and Heidegger, and the result over the next decade would be the distinctive philosophy we call existentialism. Sartre's version of existentialism begins with a dramatic thesis. Existence precedes essence. For manufactured objects, essence precedes existence. The concept of a knife exists before any particular knife is made, and the knife is made to fulfill that concept. But for human beings, the order is reversed. We exist first, find ourselves thrown into the world, and only then do we define ourselves through our choices. There is no human nature that determines what we must be, no divine blueprint we are meant to fulfill, no essence that precedes our existence and tells us who we are. The consequences of this thesis are radical. If there is no predetermined human nature, then we are responsible for making ourselves through our choices. We cannot appeal to God, or nature, or society, or psychology to explain why we are the way we are. We have chosen it. Even the circumstances that seem to constrain us, our bodies, our histories, our material conditions, become what they are for us through the way we interpret and respond to them. A disability is not inherently limiting. It becomes limiting or not depending on how we take it up. This absolute responsibility produces what Sartre calls anguish. It is not merely that we must choose. We must choose without any external guidance that would tell us what we ought to choose. The values we live by are not given to us from outside. We create them through our choices, and we cannot escape responsibility for those choices by pointing to anything beyond ourselves. When I choose not only for myself, but in some sense for all humanity. I affirm that this is how a human being should act. This weight of responsibility, fully faced, is anguishing. Most people, Sartre argues, flee from this anguish into what he calls bad faith. Bad faith is the denial of freedom, the pretense that we are determined when we are actually free. The waiter in a Paris café provides Sartre's famous example. He moves with exaggerated precision, carrying his tray with studied care, playing at being a waiter. He is trying to be a waiter in the way an inkwell is an inkwell, as if his identity were a fixed thing rather than a continuous choice. But human beings are not things. We cannot be reduced to social roles. The waiter is not a waiter. He is a free consciousness playing the role of a waiter, and his elaborate performance is a flight from the recognition of his own freedom. Bad faith takes many forms. The woman on a date who does not notice that her companion is holding her hand, treating her body as an inert thing to avoid acknowledging the sexual situation. This is bad faith. The anti-Semite who treats Jews as a fixed category with a fixed essence, denying the individuality and freedom of each Jewish person. This is bad faith. Anyone who says, "I can't help it, that's just how I am," is in bad faith. We can always help it. We can always choose otherwise. The constraint we point to is real only because we consent to treat it as real. Sartre's 1938 novel Nausea gives visceral expression to these philosophical themes. The protagonist, Antoine Roquentin, lives alone in a provincial French town conducting historical research. He begins to experience episodes of intense discomfort that he cannot explain, a kind of sickness that overtakes him when he looks at ordinary objects. Gradually, he comes to understand what is happening. The world is revealing itself to him as sheer existence, stripped of the meanings and categories that normally make it manageable. The climactic scene takes place in a park. Roquentin sits on a bench and stares at the root of a chestnut tree. The root is black, knotted, obscene in its brute fairness. Roquentin realizes that the word root no longer captures what he is seeing. The word is an abstraction, a classification that imposes order on the chaos of existence. But existence itself has no order. It simply is, contingent, unjustified, absurd. The root exists, but it has no reason to exist. It just exists, and so does everything else, including Roquentin himself. This is the nausea, the confrontation with existence in its nauseating contingency. Things are de trop, superfluous, excessive, without justification. There is no reason why the world exists rather than not existing, no reason why it is this way rather than some other way. We impose reasons on it through language and concepts, but these are our projections. Existence itself is innocent of meaning. The nausea sounds like despair, but Sartre's philosophy does not end there. If we are radically free, and if there is no meaning except what we create, then we must create, we must commit, engage, take responsibility for the world as well as for ourselves. The ethics Sartre develops most fully in his lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, insists on choice and commitment. We cannot wait for values to be handed to us. We must forge them in action. This means that there are no excuses. We cannot blame our circumstances, our upbringing, our unconscious drives. We are what we do. A coward is someone who acts in a cowardly way. There is no cowardly essence hidden behind the actions. Similarly, there is no noble soul trapped in a life of base actions. We are our acts, our projects, our commitments. Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Sartre's existentialism was enormously influential in the years after World War II. It spoke to a generation that had witnessed the collapse of European civilization and could no longer believe in the moral certainties of their parents. The emphasis on freedom and responsibility resonated with post-war intellectuals seeking to rebuild meaning after the catastrophe. But Sartre's philosophy also faced criticism for overstating human freedom, for underestimating the ways we are constrained by bodies and histories, for substituting rhetoric for argument. And there is the question of whether Sartre's radical freedom can provide what it promises. If I create my own values, if there is no standard beyond my choice, then what makes my choice better than any other? The worry that haunted Nietzsche reappears. Meaning created by arbitrary will seems to be no meaning at all. Sartre would respond that this worry is itself a symptom of bad faith, a longing for external validation that the authentic individual must overcome. Whether this response satisfies is a question each reader must answer. Albert Camus opens The Myth of Sisyphus with a stark declaration: there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. This opening sets the terms of Camus' investigation. The question is not abstract, not whether meaning exists in some metaphysical sense, but urgent and practical. If life has no meaning, why go on living? If the universe is absurd, if our deepest needs are met with silence, what prevents the inference that we should end it all? Camus wants to answer these questions honestly, without evasion or false comfort. He wants to face the absurd without flinching and see what happens. The absurd for Camus is not a property of the world alone. The world is not absurd in itself. It is simply indifferent. Nor is the absurd in us alone. Our need for meaning, our demand that the universe makes sense, is a human need that we cannot escape. The absurd arises from the confrontation between these two, between our longing for clarity and the opacity of the world, between our demand for meaning and the universe's silence. The absurd is the divorce between the human spirit and its conditions. Camus catalogues the faces of absurdity, the mechanical repetition of daily life, rising, eating, working, sleeping, rising again. The sudden strangeness that descends when familiar routines lose their grip. The recognition that time is passing, that we are moving toward death, that the future we plan for will one day arrive and find us not there. The why that sometimes breaks through habit, the question that cannot be answered and cannot be silenced. These moments reveal the absurd that is always lurking beneath the surface of ordinary life. What are the possible responses? Camus identifies 3 temptations. The first is physical suicide, the conclusion that if life has no meaning, it is not worth living. Camus rejects this as a capitulation. Suicide concedes that the absurd has won, that the confrontation is unbearable, that we would rather not exist than exist without meaning. But this is to accept the very premise we should question. Why should meaninglessness make life not worth living? Perhaps life is worth living precisely in revolt against meaninglessness. The second temptation is what Camus calls philosophical suicide, the leap of faith that resolves the absurd by denying one of its terms. The religious believer who trusts in God despite the silence, the philosopher who posits a rational order beneath the apparent chaos, the existentialist who discovers meaning through the sheer act of commitment, all of these, in Camus' view, are forms of escape. They evade the confrontation with absurdity by introducing a solution that the evidence does not support. Camus is particularly critical of the religious response, which he sees as sacrificing intellectual honesty for emotional comfort. But he is equally critical of secular philosophies that claim to have transcended the absurd. The absurd persists as long as we do. The third response, and the one Camus endorses, is acceptance combined with revolt. We accept the absurd. We acknowledge that the universe is silent, that our demand for meaning goes unanswered, that there is no final truth that would make everything make sense. But we do not submit to it. We revolt against it, not by denying it, but by refusing to let it dictate our actions. The absurd man does not seek a meaning that would dissolve the absurd. He lives with the absurd, lucidly and defiantly. This revolt has several dimensions. There is the revolt of consciousness, refusing to turn away from the truth of the human condition, maintaining a clear-eyed awareness that most people avoid. There is the revolt of action, continuing to engage with life, to pursue projects, to create, even knowing that these activities are ultimately pointless. And there is the revolt of intensity, living as fully as possible, squeezing from life every drop of experience, because there is nothing beyond life to wait for. Camus insists that this revolt does not lead to nihilism in the sense of moral indifference. If nothing matters ultimately, it does not follow that nothing matters at all. On the contrary, the absurd man, precisely because he has no illusions about cosmic meaning, can commit more fully to the values he chooses. He does not act morally because God commands it, or because morality is built into the structure of the universe. He acts morally because he chooses to, because this is the life he wants to live. The absurd liberates rather than constrains. Camus distinguishes his position from Sartre's existentialism, though the two are often confused. Sartre, in Camus' view, sought to overcome the absurd through the act of commitment itself, as if the sheer intensity of choice could create meaning where none existed. Camus thought this was another form of philosophical suicide, another attempt to escape the confrontation. For Camus, the absurd cannot be overcome, only lived with. The moment we think we have transcended it, we have lost our grip on the truth. The myth of Sisyphus appeared in 1942 during the German occupation of France. Camus was involved in the resistance, editing the underground newspaper Combat, and his philosophy was forged in circumstances of genuine danger. The question of whether life is worth living was not academic for him or for his readers. Europe was engulfed in a war that seemed to confirm every pessimistic diagnosis of human nature. The question was how to go on, not just physically, but spiritually, in a world that had revealed its capacity for atrocity. Camus' answer was luminous, defiant, strangely hopeful, despite its bleak premises. The absurd does not forbid happiness. It makes happiness possible in a new way. Not the happiness of illusion, of believing that everything will be fine, but the happiness of lucidity, of accepting the worst and finding that life goes on anyway, that the morning sun still falls on the stones, that there is still beauty and friendship and the Mediterranean light. But this vision needed a concrete embodiment. In the next chapter, we turn to the figures through whom Camus made his philosophy vivid: Meursault, the stranger who refuses to lie, and Sisyphus, the hero of the absurd. Meursault, the protagonist of Camus' novel The Stranger, opens his story with words that have shocked readers since 1942. Mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I can't be sure. This is not grief, it is not shock, it is a flat statement of fact with a note of uncertainty about the precise date. The telegram from the nursing home was not clear. Meursault will attend the funeral, but when the director asks if he wants to see his mother one last time, he declines. During the vigil, he drinks coffee, smokes cigarettes, and notices irrelevant details: the colour of the walls, the appearance of the other mourners, his own fatigue. When the funeral is over, he goes back to Algiers, goes swimming, sees a movie with his girlfriend Marie, and sleeps with her. Life continues. Meursault's crime comes later in the novel, but it is almost incidental to its meaning. On a beach, in a confrontation that never quite becomes coherent, he shoots an Arab man. The murder is not premeditated, not motivated by hatred or fear, barely even motivated at all. The sun is blinding, the heat oppressive, and Meursault fires. One shot, then four more. The act is gratuitous, absurd in the sense that it cannot be explained by reasons that would make it intelligible. The trial that follows is the heart of the novel, but Meursault is not really tried for murder. He is tried for not crying at his mother's funeral. The prosecutor dwells obsessively on his behaviour in the days after her death. The coffee, the cigarettes, the swimming, the girlfriend, the comedy he watched at the cinema. This, the prosecutor argues, reveals the soul of a monster, a man without normal human feelings. Meursault does not defend himself effectively because he does not understand what is expected of him. He is honest when lies would save him. He refuses to say he regrets killing the Arab when he does not feel regret. He will not play the game. Meursault is condemned to death, and the sentence is carried out with the same impersonal efficiency with which everything else in his life has occurred. In his final hours, a chaplain visits him, urging him to turn to God. Meursault refuses violently. He has no hope of an afterlife, no expectation of meaning beyond this world. But in his refusal, he finds a strange peace. He opens himself to the benign indifference of the universe, and this indifference is liberating rather than terrifying. He realizes he has been happy and is happy still. On the night before his execution, he feels the stars and the signs of the sky, and he is reconciled with the world because he no longer demands from it what it cannot give. Meursault is not a hero in any conventional sense. He is passive, often obtuse, morally unremarkable, except for his stubborn honesty. But it is precisely this honesty that Camus values. Meursault refuses to lie about his feelings, even when lying would be in his interest. He refuses to pretend emotions he does not have, to perform the social rituals that would make his behavior acceptable. This refusal is a kind of integrity, even if it is not a morally admirable integrity. He sees clearly, without illusion, and this clarity is the first condition of revolt. Sisyphus provides a different emblem of the absurd hero. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. Each time he reaches the summit, the boulder rolls back down and he must descend to begin again. There is no completion, no progress, no end. The task is meaningless, and Sisyphus knows it is meaningless. This is his torture. But Camus finds in Sisyphus something the gods did not intend. The moment of interest is not the struggle upward, but the pause at the top, when the boulder rolls away and Sisyphus begins his descent. In that moment, he is conscious of his fate. He sees the absurdity of his labour and knows that it will never end, yet he continues. He walks down to begin again, and in that walking down, he is superior to his fate. The rock is his thing. The struggle is his struggle. Even in the most hopeless situation, something belongs to him that the gods cannot touch. This is why Camus concludes, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Not happy in spite of his condition, but because of the way he takes up his condition. The happiness is in the revolt, in the refusal to be crushed, in the lucid acceptance of absurdity, combined with the determination to keep going. Sisyphus does not expect the boulder to stay at the top. He does not hope for divine intervention or some change in the rules. He knows exactly what his existence is, and he chooses it anyway. This is the absurd logic. Once we accept that life is meaningless, the meaninglessness loses its power over us. We are freed from the anxiety of seeking meaning where there is none. We can devote ourselves to the immediate, the tangible, the present moment, without the metaphysical weight that comes from wanting existence to be justified. The world becomes lighter, not heavier. Whether this logic works is another question. Critics have pointed out that Camus' happiness is a strangely abstract affair, a philosophical conclusion rather than a lived feeling. Can anyone really be happy in Sisyphus's situation? Is the revolt Camus describes enough to sustain a human life? Or is it just another form of evasion, the claim that absurdity does not hurt when in fact it does? These questions have no definitive answers. What Camus offers is not a solution to the problem of meaning, but a way of living with the problem. Lucidity, revolt, passion, freedom. These are the virtues of the absurd man, and they are available to anyone willing to face the truth of the human condition. Whether that truth can be borne, and whether bearing it can be called happiness, is something each person must discover for themselves. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist living in Vienna when the Nazis annexed Austria in 1938. Over the next 7 years, he was stripped of his medical practice, forced into a ghetto, and finally deported to the concentration camps. He spent time in Auschwitz-Dachau and other camps, losing his parents, his brother, and his pregnant wife. When he was liberated in 1945, he had lost nearly everyone he loved and had witnessed suffering on a scale that defied comprehension. The camps were designed to dehumanize. Prisoners were reduced to numbers, stripped of all possessions and all dignity, subjected to arbitrary cruelty, worked to exhaustion, starved and beaten and killed according to the whims of guards or the impersonal logic of extermination. The conditions were such that survival seemed to depend purely on chance, on avoiding the wrong transport, the wrong work detail, the wrong glance from a capo. Yet Frankl observed that survival also depended on something else, something internal. Those who had something to live for, a purpose, a task, a person waiting for them, were more likely to endure. Those who lost their sense of meaning often gave up and died. This observation became the foundation of Frankl's psychological theory, which he called logotherapy, from the Greek logos, meaning word or meaning. Against Freud's emphasis on the pleasure principle and Adler's emphasis on the will to power, Frankl posited a third drive, the will to meaning. Human beings, he argued, are fundamentally motivated by the need to find purpose in their existence. When this need is frustrated, we fall into what he called the existential vacuum, a state of emptiness and despair that manifests as boredom, apathy, depression, or destructive behavior. The camps provided the most extreme test case for this theory. In circumstances where everything had been taken away, possessions, relationships, health, hope, meaning alone remained as a resource. A man who believed he had something to accomplish, a woman who imagined being reunited with her child, a scientist who wanted to complete his research, these fragments of purpose could sustain life when all external supports had collapsed. Frankl himself held on to the image of lecturing about the psychology of the concentration camp, of teaching what he had learned from his experience. This purpose, absurdly intellectual in the face of mass murder, helped him survive. But Frankl's point is not that purpose guarantees survival. Many prisoners with strong purposes were murdered anyway. The point is rather that meaning transforms the experience of suffering. It cannot prevent pain, but it can give pain a significance that makes it bearable. The famous Nietzsche quotation that Frankl often cited captures this: "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Where does meaning come from? Frankl identified three sources. The first is creative work, accomplishing tasks, making contributions, bringing something into the world that would not exist without our effort. This is the meaning of the artist, the scientist, the builder. The second is experience, encountering beauty, love, truth, the presence of another person. This is the meaning of the lover, the nature mystic, the friend. The third is attitude, the stance we take toward unavoidable suffering. When we cannot change our circumstances, we can still choose how to face them. A person dying of a terminal illness cannot change the fact of death, but he can choose whether to die with dignity, with concern for others, with acceptance rather than bitterness. This is the last freedom that cannot be taken away. Frankl's account of suffering as a potential source of meaning is easily misunderstood. He is not saying that suffering is good or that we should seek it out. He is saying that when suffering is unavoidable, it need not be meaningless. The person who faces suffering with courage and dignity has achieved something, has responded to the human condition in a way that has value. This is not compensation for the suffering. Nothing could compensate for Auschwitz, but it is a refusal to let suffering have the final word. Critics have raised questions about Frankl's theory. Is the will to meaning really a fundamental drive, or is it a rationalization for drives that go deeper? Can meaning really be found in the most extreme circumstances, Or is Frankl generalizing from exceptional cases? His emphasis on attitude can seem to verge on victim blaming, as if those who despaired in the camps failed to find meaning they should have found. Frankl does not intend this implication, but it hovers around the edges of his account. There is also the question of what logotherapy offers to nihilism. Frankl does not claim that life has inherent meaning in some cosmic sense. He claims that meaning can be found, created, discovered, but always by the individual, always in response to particular circumstances. This is closer to the existentialist position than to traditional religious views. The meaning Frankl describes is not waiting to be received from God or from the universe. It is constructed through human response to the conditions of existence. But there is a difference between Frankl and the existentialists. For Sartre, meaning is created by arbitrary choice, and there is no standard by which one choice is better than another. For Frankl, meaning is discovered. There are genuine meanings waiting to be recognized, even if they do not exist apart from our recognition. The task awaiting you, the person who needs you, the suffering that calls for your response, these are not invented but found. Logotherapy helps the patient discover what is already there, not fabricate something ex nihilo. This is a subtle but important distinction. Frankl preserves a sense that meaning has objectivity without claiming that it is built into the cosmos. Meaning is objective in the way that a task is objective. It really does need to be done, even if its importance depends on human purposes. This intermediate position avoids both the despair of radical nihilism and the bad faith of pretending that the universe cares. Frankl's work has been influential in psychology and beyond, offering a counterpoint to the dominant frameworks of psychoanalysis and behaviorism. His account of meaning as central to human flourishing has found empirical support in subsequent research on well-being and resilience. But his place in the history of nihilism is as a respondent rather than a diagnostician. He took the nihilist challenge seriously and offered what he believed was an answer. Whether that answer is adequate is another matter. In 1971, the American philosopher Thomas Nagel published an essay called The Absurd, offering a cooler, more analytical treatment of the themes that had preoccupied the existentialists. Nagel agreed that human life is absurd, but he disagreed about what that meant and how we should respond. His essay has become a classic of analytic philosophy, a demonstration that the question of meaning can be approached with precision rather than drama. The absurd for Nagel arises from a specific collision. On the one hand, we cannot help taking our lives seriously. We care intensely about our projects, our relationships, our futures. We act as if what we do matters, and we could not function otherwise. On the other hand, we are capable of stepping back and seeing our lives from a detached perspective, what Nagel calls the view from nowhere. From this perspective, our concerns appear arbitrary, our seriousness groundless. Why does it matter whether I finish my book, build my career, maintain my friendships? In 100 years, I will be dead and forgotten. In 1 billion years, the sun will have consumed the earth. The things I care about most intensely are, from a cosmic perspective, of no importance whatsoever. The absurd is the collision between these two perspectives, the engaged and the detached, the inside and the outside. We cannot abandon either one. We cannot become purely detached beings, coolly indifferent to everything, because we are built to care. But we also cannot avoid moments of detachment, glimpses of how arbitrary our concerns appear from outside. The absurd is not a property of the world, but a condition of self-conscious existence. Beings who can see themselves from outside while continuing to live from inside. Nagel thinks the existentialists, particularly Camus, misunderstood this situation. Camus framed the absurd as a confrontation between human needs and cosmic indifference, suggesting that we need the universe to provide meaning and are frustrated when it does not. But Nagel doubts that this is the source of our malaise. Even if God existed and the universe was suffused with meaning, we could still step back and ask, so what? The absurd does not depend on the absence of cosmic purpose. It arises from our capacity to question any purpose, no matter how deeply rooted. This leads Nagel to a different response than Camus offered. Camus prescribed revolt, a heroic defiance of the universe's silence. Nagel finds this melodramatic. If the absurd is a permanent feature of self-conscious existence, then revolt against it is absurd in turn. We are not being oppressed by a hostile cosmos. We are simply creatures with a peculiar capacity for self-transcendence. The appropriate response, Nagel suggests, is not defiance but irony, a light touch, an acknowledgement of the absurdity that does not take itself too seriously. This ironic stance allows us to continue with our lives without being paralyzed by cosmic meaninglessness. We can take our projects seriously while knowing, in some sense, that they are not ultimately serious. This is not hypocrisy but maturity, the recognition that human life operates on multiple registers at once. The mother caring for her child is doing something genuinely important, even if, from the view from nowhere, it is cosmically trivial. Both perspectives are true simultaneously, and we must live with the tension. Nagel's essay clears away some of the drama that had accumulated around the concept of the absurd. It shows that the problem can be stated precisely and that the responses can be assessed without appeals to rhetoric or emotion. But it also raises questions about whether Nagel has captured everything the existentialists were worried about. The ironic stance he recommends may be appropriate for comfortable academics in stable societies. Is it adequate to the more desperate situations that Camus and Frankl had in mind? The contemporary landscape of nihilism extends beyond these philosophical treatments. Cosmic nihilism has intensified with the growth of scientific knowledge. We now understand that the universe is not merely indifferent, but actively hostile to complexity. The second law of thermodynamics ensures that all ordered structures, including life, will eventually dissolve into entropy. The heat death of the universe, trillions of years in the future but certain, represents the final victory of meaninglessness over meaning. Every human achievement, every civilization, every memory will be erased as if it never existed. Some find this prospect liberating rather than distressing. If nothing we do will last forever, then we are freed from the pressure to achieve eternal significance. We can focus on the present, on the local, on what matters to us here and now. The heat death is too distant to affect our lives, and our lives have whatever meaning we give them, regardless of what happens in 10 trillion years. The therapeutic turn in contemporary culture has addressed existential questions through the language of psychology rather than philosophy. Meaning has become something to be cultivated, managed, enhanced, a component of well-being alongside positive emotions and supportive relationships. This approach has practical value, but it risks trivializing the question. The nihilist challenge is not that we feel meaningless. It is that we might be meaningless, regardless of how we feel. A therapy that makes us feel better about meaninglessness does not answer the philosophical question. It simply teaches us to stop asking. The pragmatic response holds that meaning is whatever works, whatever enables us to function, to flourish, to contribute. If believing in meaning makes our lives go better, then meaning exists for practical purposes, and the metaphysical question is irrelevant. William James defended something like this view, and it has pragmatic appeal, but it also seems to evade the issue. The nihilist is not asking what beliefs are useful, he is asking what is true. The religious response continues to maintain that meaning requires transcendence, that nothing in the natural world can ground the values we need to live. Without God, without eternal life, without some realm beyond the physical, nihilism cannot be answered. This response has the virtue of taking the problem seriously. If the universe is just matter and energy, blindly obeying physical laws, then it is hard to see how meaning could be built into its structure. The question is whether the religious answer is believable, and for many people in the modern world, it is not. These positions coexist uneasily in contemporary culture. We have not resolved the nihilist challenge. We have learned to live alongside it, sometimes ignoring it, sometimes engaging it, sometimes hoping it will go away. The question that Nietzsche posed over a century ago, how do we live after the death of God, remains open. We have traced the emergence of a question that did not exist in its present form before the 19th century. Ancient and medieval thinkers asked whether life was good, whether virtue led to happiness, whether the soul was immortal, but they asked these questions within frameworks that assumed the answers. The idea that the universe might have no purpose whatsoever, that human existence might be an accident with no significance, that our deepest values might be projections onto a void. This idea emerged slowly from the cracks in the certainties that had sustained Western civilization for 2,000 years. Schopenhauer gave this idea its philosophical foundation, showing that pessimism could be systematic and rigorous. Dostoevsky gave it dramatic power, creating characters who voice the nihilist challenge with such force that readers have never forgotten them. Nietzsche saw what was happening before his contemporaries and tried to imagine what might come next. The existentialists of the 20th century, Heidegger, Sartre, Camus, developed his insights in different directions, exploring how we might live authentically in a world without given meanings. Frankl offered a response from the extremity of human suffering, arguing that meaning can be found even when it cannot be received. And analytic philosophers like Nagel have shown that these questions can be stated precisely even if they cannot be answered definitively. Where does this leave us? The nihilist challenge has not been refuted. No philosopher has demonstrated to general satisfaction that life has inherent meaning, purpose, or value. The religious answers that once provided certainty are no longer available to many people, and the secular replacements have not filled the void. We continue to live as if our lives matter, but we cannot prove that they do. One response is the Nietzschean path. We create meaning through our own creative will, affirming life in the face of its absurdity. This response requires strength, the capacity to impose values rather than receive them. It is heroic but demanding, and it is not clear that everyone is capable of it, or that everyone should try. The Übermensch remains an aspiration rather than an achievement, and the shadow of arbitrary will hangs over any meaning we claim to have created. Another response is the Camusian path. We accept the absurd without trying to overcome it. We revolt against meaninglessness not by defeating it, but by refusing to surrender to it. We continue our tasks, our relationships, our lives, with lucid awareness that they rest on nothing but themselves. This is not pessimism, but a kind of defiant happiness. Sisyphus walking down from the summit, knowing he will climb again, finding satisfaction in the struggle itself. A third response is the Sartrean path. We commit, engage, take responsibility. If there is no predetermined essence, then we are radically free to make ourselves through our choices. The absence of inherent meaning is not a loss, but a liberation. We are condemned to be free, and we must live up to that condemnation by choosing authentically, without bad faith, without pretending that our circumstances determine us. A fourth response is the Franklian path. We discover meaning in the concrete circumstances of our lives, in work, in love, in the attitude we take toward unavoidable suffering. Meaning need not be cosmic to be real. The task that needs doing, the person who needs our help, the suffering that calls for our response, These are genuine sources of significance, even if they do not rest on metaphysical foundations. And there is a fifth, more modest response that does not claim the status of a philosophy. It holds simply that meaning does not need to be cosmic to be real. What matters to us matters, and perhaps that is enough. We are finite creatures with finite concerns, and our concerns have whatever weight we give them. The demand that the universe validate our values is a confused demand, a projection of human needs onto a reality that has no use for such categories. Once we abandon this demand, we can get on with living. This modest response may be the closest thing to a consensus that our culture has achieved. It does not resolve the tension between the engaged and detached perspectives that Nagel described. It does not answer the nihilist's challenge with a knockdown argument. It simply sets the challenge aside as unanswerable and moves on. Many people, perhaps most, live according to something like this response, even if they could not articulate it. They do not believe their lives have cosmic significance, but they do not lose sleep over it. They find enough meaning in their daily rounds, their families, their work, their pleasures to get by. But there are others for whom this is not enough. They feel the nihilist challenge as an open wound, a question that will not let them rest. They want to know whether their lives matter, really matter, not just to themselves, but in some larger sense that would survive their own extinction. For them, the modest response feels like evasion, a turning away from the deepest question a human being can ask. Perhaps there is no resolution available. Perhaps the question of meaning is one that human beings are fated to ask, but not to answer. We are creatures who demand purpose from a universe that offers none, and the tension between demand and silence is the permanent condition of self-conscious existence. We can learn to live with this tension, that is what maturity means, but we cannot dissolve it. The abyss remains. And yet people go on. They get up in the morning. They care for their children. They work at their jobs. They create art, build institutions, fight for causes they believe in. They love and grieve and hope and despair. The fact that they cannot justify these activities in cosmic terms does not prevent them from engaging in them wholeheartedly. Perhaps this is the deepest response to nihilism, not an argument, but a practice, not a philosophy, but a life. Picture a woman walking along a beach as the sun sets. She has lost much in her life, people she loved, dreams she held, certainties she once possessed. She knows that the universe is indifferent, that her death will not matter to the stars, that everything she has done or will do will eventually be forgotten. But she is walking. The sand is cool beneath her feet. The sky is streaked with colour. Somewhere behind her, a child is calling to its mother. The world is neither kind nor cruel, it simply is. And she is part of it, for this moment, on this beach under this sky. She does not know what any of it means. Perhaps it means nothing. But she takes another step, and another, and the waves continue their endless approach and retreat. This is where the question leaves us. Not with answers, but with lives to be lived. Not with certainty, but with the ongoing human situation, consciousness confronting existence, demanding meaning, receiving silence, and continuing anyway. The philosophers have given us ways to think about this situation, to articulate its structure and assess the possible responses. But they have not told us what to do. That decision, as always, is ours.